Everybody to the CEFACT Global Trust Registry project. This is the second of the sort of 2 meetings we have in rapid succession every 2 weeks. The previous one was 17 hours ago and had a fair number of people from mostly from Europe, as well as Australia participating. What we're going to do today is kind of go through what we went through yesterday, but with the added benefit of your participation and people like Steve who weren't in the discussion yesterday. So I can now ask Steve some questions that I kind of came up with as we went through yesterday. The discussions and the work we do under CEFACT projects are under codes of conduct and intellectual property rules. You're all aware of these, but I'll just repeat them for the record. The work we do is effectively an open source, royalty-free contribution. It will go towards the CEFACT, who then will make, if they accept them, recommendations to the nation states of the UN. What we want to go through today is a kind of a quick recap, I suppose, of 2 weeks ago, just so everyone's happy with the way I'm going to summarize what we agreed 2 weeks ago. And then we're going to kind of look at the forward work that's been going on since then, particularly on the digital identity anchor. What I guess I could do is, if given the numbers we have here, I know all of you in one way or another, but I'm very happy if any of you wants to introduce yourselves to the other members of the group. If it's the first time on the call or something, feel free to put your hand up and I'll give you the space to say hi. If that isn't your kettle of fish, whatever it is, feel free to use the chat to put something in the chat if you want to say hi on the chat as well. That's another way of doing it. I will.
I'll say hi.
Oh, yeah, go, Brianna. Go, Brianna.
I do know some of the people on the call, most, but I don't know if I've met a couple of you. So I'm Brianna, and I am in the beautiful city of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. And I work with the BC Gov on my institutional trust. Yeah, I think that's it.
It's very cool. That's good. And I'm sure most of the people on the call are very mindful of the work BC Gov did, early pioneering work, and still does it on sort of verifiable credentials and registration of organizations and stuff. So really good to have you here with us, Bri. So the quick recap on the 2 weeks ago meeting, we did a bit of chat, Steve and I, in fact, about kind of how we handle the existing work. So the digital identity anchor concept comes out of work from United Nations Transparency Protocol. And there's a sort of body of work that already exists, that pre-exists this project, and we were discussing kind of how to handle it. So I think Steve and I more or less landed on it. We'll see a few elements of that work as we go through this deck. One thing I'm going to suggest sort of to Steve, we don't have to decide it right now, is it's very likely the work in this project will inform, update, consider, propose changes to that spec content for DIA. That's the purpose, right? What I think might happen is that having done that, we might agree, if you agree, that work might go back into the UNTP body, because if someone wants to implement the UNTP protocol, it might be easy for them to see kind of all the elements in one place. It might be a better place for it to be kind of curated. So we'll get there when we get there, but it might be that's something we do. So we separately work on it like a fork, and then we kind of pull it back in if that's the way it works. Any immediate reaction to that idea, Steve? Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, that was thinking more or less how it would work, yeah? Yeah.
Okay, cool. Excellent. That's great. That's reassuring. I just felt odd having a sort of limb off your base that has this digital identity specification in it. The main topic of 2 weeks ago, and it's still sort of carried on after the meetings, was how might something like this Global Trust Registry project, which is promoting the idea of a directory of authoritative registrars and other elements of work, how does that coexist with the bodies of work done by GLIFE, GS1, the IRA Foundation that are on board in this call as well, and other such groups and efforts? So the sort of fundamental summary I'm trying to provide here is of 3 points. Firstly, we kind of respect and recognize that all of these efforts are providing unique additional value, otherwise they kind of won't persist and can carry on. We argue effectively that this project is doing something different and worth doing. It's not the same as these other projects. The second thing is kind of the difference, if you like. The Global Trust Registry project under the CEFACT body we'll be looking at nation-state registrars. So the unit of currency for the United Nations are nations, and therefore what we look to are what do those nations do in terms of registration of things that are interesting for supply chains. So we're looking at those authoritative registrars is the term we're using in this project. That's not to say that neither GLIFE, GS1 or IRA aren't authorities as well. They're authorities in their own domain, but the domain we're reflecting here is nation states. So the last point, this point 3, is sort of towards this idea that actually we've all got some value to gain, I hope, out of each other's efforts. So there's a number of ways in which we hope we will cooperate and support each other and provide value. There's a few instances in this text that you can see on the screen right now. One of the ways I've simplistically described this is if we imagine the directory that we eventually promote, it's going to be a bit like ICAO's PKD kind of system where participants provide sort of information to a central registry, and that registry then provides that information back out to others to sort of trust, if you like. In that registry would list the authoritative registrars of nation states, but we'll also describe what those registrars do, what they provide, and how you might trust them. So things like what's the legal basis for them, what kind of terms and conditions do they issue identifiers on, and so on. But we will also recognize, subject to their agreement, the nature of the things they publish. So if they, for example, recognize or publish things like LEIs or VLIs, because that's quite possible for an authoritative registrar to be what's called an LOU in GLIFE's terms, a local operating unit, or indeed a QVI, a VLI issuing entity, then we can put them in a sort of attributes column, if you like, of this row. So my simplistic language is, whilst GLIFE and GS1 and even IRA won't be rows in this directory, they can very well be columns of attributes and discussion and descriptions of what happened. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. Anybody who's in these calls or seen the minutes, is that a reasonable submission, a summation of what I've kind of rushed through? Okay, I'll take thumbs up and silence as a yes.
I'll just add one tiny piece there, John, is that IRA won't be doing any organizational registration itself. We would be pointing to the various different registries, whether they be source of truth for a nation or the GS1, GLIFE, etc.
Yeah, that's great, Daryl, and I think that's where this significant additional value is. It's like we won't stop people like Dun & Bradstreet, for example, doing their Duns number stuff and the other things they do, and nor should we, because they're another layer of service provision that might provide value to participants, as IRA can be for everybody in another sort of dimension. So absolutely right. That makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you. So the main thing I wanted to talk about is the work that primarily Alina has been doing over the last few weeks on the digital identity anchor, and she's taken a particularly unique perspective on this. As you might expect, she's a lawyer by training and is the authority for land registration in Registradores in Spain, the registrar for Spain. So her legal training gives her obviously the legal perspective on most things. She's done the work, but it's 2 a.m. in the morning in Spain right now, so she's not on the call. So I'll do my best to reflect her work, and we'll look at that sort of right now. So the thing we're talking about, this digital identity anchor, in my rather messy diagram on the screen right now, is the sort of area 3 of this thing. It's in an interaction between participants in a supply chain, where one participant says to the other, I am this organization, I certainly am this organization, and it's a sort of part of the identity interchange between organizations in a supply chain interaction. And there's a whole bunch of thinking about what would need to be inside a digital identity anchor to make it verifiable and trustworthy and so on. That's the whole essence of this project. There's a number of other things this project is looking at, but that's kind of the area we're mostly focused on in this discussion. Drummond, please.
Very simple question. And I've read some of the documents, but I just want to be clear. A digital identity anchor, is that a document, or is it what? Are you going to explain more your definition of the DIA?
I'll start, but one of the primary authors is on the call, so Steve's on the call. So it's a credential in the terminology that you and I would understand a credential to be. So it's based on a verifiable credential, structured W3C VC. And it's a specific type of credential in terms of purpose. It's intent and purpose.
That's
Steve. Yeah,
that's
Steve,
what I thought, but it was very helpful. Go ahead.
Steve, you fill in all the blanks I've left.
Well, it's basically the glue between your DID and your authoritative registered identity. So it's issued by the registrar to a member of the register who can prove to the registrar that they are the controller of their DID.
100%.
And so, yeah, that's what
Can
it
I
is.
ask a second question, which is it therefore a generalization of what Glyph has done with the VLEI?
Yeah, yes and no. It's somewhat different, and there's actually some useful discussion about what Alina's work and what she's sort of flushed out of around what it might include and what it doesn't. So we'll get to that. It's
Cool.
It's quite similar, right?
Yeah.
And on this diagram, you can see the flow that, in a sense, Steve was alluding to, that there's a natural legal requirement for any jurisdiction about if you want to register a business in their jurisdiction. You need to go through certain processes. You need to prove certain things. There's whatever the law says is the law. That step sort of one, application to be registered. Two, they do the checks that are done in their jurisdiction. If they decide to allow you to be registered as a business, you get some form of identifier. You get an Australian ABN, Australian business number, issued to you by ASIC. And the step 4 is the kind of 4 and 5 of the kind of new novel parts that we're recommending, which is at this point now, having established their bona fides, they are in fact a trustworthy organization worthy of a recognition in the legal jurisdiction. They now will say, as Steve said, here are the DIDs that we want to use in our transactions. Here are some things that we want to be recognized as belonging to us and linked to, bound to the identifier you've given us. Now, there's going to be some interesting discussion you'll see in the text of the document, I'll get to in a second, about potentially 3 levels of information inside a DIA. And the first level will be information controlled and managed and issued by the registered authority. It's their responsibility, it's their liability, it's their responsibility under law and so on. They control this. The second body of data might be data that they have received from the subject or the applicant that they've tested or they've checked or they've done some sort of quality control on. And they've, so for example, checked to see that they do actually control the DID that they have asserted is the DID they want to use. The third level could be information that they really have no say over. It's just something that the applicant has provided that if I were to use a flippant example, like me saying my nickname is something. Now, nobody really cares what I say my nickname is. It doesn't need to be true or not. It's just me saying it. And it could be included. But what the registered authority might say is, this is like untested or unverified. It's just something provided to us by the applicant. So the 3 levels would be, we control this. It's our responsibility. We assert by law this is important, so on. The second would be, we've checked this stuff, found it to be true at the time we checked it. But it's not under our control. It's just something that was asserted and we checked. The third thing is it was stuff given to us, and that I think might be useful later. The specification, this is where I might ask some questions since you're on the line, Steve, has this is the existing kind of very simple information map architecture. So if I hover my cursor around, you'll see it. There are GitLab pages. So if I click this link, it'll open and we'll see it. That contain the current text that describes a digital identity anchor. Those pages are rendered as a website. So you can kind of see them as web pages through Docusaurus, and you can read them as a sort of easier to read visualization of that information. And that's where I'd recommend you go if you want to see the current thinking about digital identity anchors as was before we sort of started this work. And then these are the questions I'd like to ask. There's a way of exploring the vocabulary. So there's another sort of link, if you like, into exploring the vocabulary, where you can kind of provide queries and look at classes and do some other interesting things if you're a data modeler. And then finally, there's a sort of another, oops, I'll go back. There's another representation of it in this jargon.sh environment. So Steve, my question to you was, which is the golden record? Where, if you like, is the spec managed, and where is the spec being represented or allowed to be explored? What do you see as the controlling data space?
All right. So I think there are 2 golden records, if you like. One is the technical spec, which is the GitLab page rendered as a website.
Okay.
But the other one for conformance with the VC data model is that we need to publish a linked data vocabulary that extends to VCDM that is used in any credential we do, right? And so that's the vocabulary ontology page. Okay. The data model thing is just a tool to create that, and it's kind of not important. You could make it in a text editor if you want. The important thing is that there is a URI that resolves to vocabulary.uncfact.org or something like this for data elements in a credential that are not part of VCDM.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm going to allow, because we've got some other experts on the call as well. Those of you who've worked in this space already, does that make sense as well for you guys? That's the approach we're going to be taking?
It generally makes sense to me. But who is the body? Who's the standards body authoritative for that spec that will have the JSON LD vocabulary?
It's you. Well, the answer to that question generally is we ought to be able to compose any authoritative vocabulary into a credential as long as that vocabulary is considered authoritative and trustworthy, right? So, for example, VCDM itself is a vocabulary published by W3C, right? And obviously we use it. Schema.org is another one, which is probably authoritative enough. But CEFACT itself is an authoritative standards body, does have a liaison agreement and mutual recognition agreement with ISO and IEC and ITU. So stuff we put on uncfact.vocabulary.org, no, sorry, vocabulary.uncfact.org can be considered an authoritative vocabulary.
Totally. That answers the question. I was just wondering where it was going to live, and if it lives there, that sounds like a pretty good place.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you both, actually. That was great. Now, what I want to now sort of show you, give a flavor of, is the work that Alina's been doing on the actual document itself. So the first image you're seeing, I'll make it a bit wider. I'm not sure how much of the screen you can see, so maybe a bit better. The first few pages in this document, this is a working draft. It's really not the final, anything like a final cut. It's just a sort of a scrapbook of ideas at the moment. I've whacked in a glossary that we have a shared glossary for all the documents we're producing. I just wanted to write a glossary once, as Drummond's taught me in the past. Write once, use many. That's just a glossary that we'll find inadequate and add to and improve as we go on, but it'll always be the sort of shared glossary. Then I've echoed from kind of Steve led this work, but the work of the project of UNTP, the requirements that UNTP identified for DIAs. And you'll note there are 8, and they're quite high level requirements, and they're quite kind of technical about the implementation of a DIA. And then we get into the text that Alina was producing. Now, again, she has a very legal perspective. What does it legally mean if an authoritative registrar issues a DIA? What does it mean for the holder? What does it mean for the relying party who receives one? What can they infer, if you like, from this? So she's gone through a kind of with a legal lens what this might mean and produced a fair amount of kind of new or novel content and thinking. So this very first kind of clause, as she would like to call them, I think of those requirements, is sort of talking around the idea of where you get the data from to issue this DIA. Now, both Joe Spencer and I have had the luxury of working through this document a bit before, of the last week or two. And we both were kind of interested in this assertion at the beginning, because as you'll see in this discussion, if I kind of scroll through here on the right-hand side, you can see there's a lot of discussion. We land on this idea of maybe, in fact, there are things that they do assert and have absolute control over, and that's their core element of what they're saying. And then there are other parts that they've checked, and then there's maybe a third part that they don't check. And these are like sort of sets. Some sets may be null in some issuances of the DIA. And Alina's sort of corroborating that thinking and sharing some. She then goes into a discussion around ownership of companies. And that's actually where, when we think about the ownership of companies, we are treading into, as you were suggesting earlier, Drummond, the level 2 information that VLIs and Glyph maintain. So Glyph is a body is under the Financial Stability Board, under the G20, and it has a particular focus on ownership of organizations and the ultimate beneficiary concept. And that's because of shell companies and other sort of artifacts that are created to obscure who actually owns companies. And they wanted to remove those risks of inappropriate funds transfers, anti-money laundering, that kind of stuff. So I don't think at the moment we have much to say about that in this project, right? We're just registering authoritative registrars. We're allowing them to publish what they choose to publish. There's a very understandable reason that they might choose as a registrar to recognize if the company already has an LEI, here's the LEI that they've asserted they have, and we've checked to see it is their LEI. And they could include that in the DIA and sort of lean on, if you like, the work of Glide from VLIs. We then go scroll back up. We then have another sort of interesting discussion where this idea of serves solely as a verifiable digital reference. So this is early text, where what in the intent of this, Alina's intent is to go to what's understood under the UN CITRAL and MLETR rules, that the electronic record is exactly the same legal stance as the physical record. And that's what Alina's intent is here, that these things should have the same weight, the same utility as the physical record that would normally produced, the PDFs and paper and whatever else people send around to sort of verify their transactions. And that had another bunch of discussion between Joe, I, and Alina about what that actually means. And then we get into this, some of the things around the issuance of a DIA. Now, this is where it gets sort of, for me, kind of interesting. We've recognized in this project, we have no right or authority to tell issuing registrars what to do, right? We can recommend things, but we have no legal authority to make things happen. And so we will need to think about the language we're using when we're describing requirements upon them in terms of issuance of a DIA. And so the words like, at the moment, we haven't gone through this with a word like shall and should and must, and use that sort of very harsh filter around what exact term should we use here for this. But the intent from Alina's point of view is that if it's a DIA under our rules, it has these specific qualities. And if it isn't under our rules, it can be under their rules, but then it's not a kind of UN CEFACT GTR DIA. It's a different kind of identity anchor. So
can I just clarify then? If we when we publish, this is a DIA technical spec. Of course, any register can just pick it up and issue it and say, I'm for example, I'm GS1 GLens, and here's a DIA compliant credential. Probably the bigger question is, notwithstanding the fact that any register, even my I don't know, my local soccer club could issue one. What registers do we register at the UN level as an authoritative registrar?
There's another document. Glad you asked that, Steve. There's another document where Alina's worked through what would a registrar need to be capable of, or be recognized as, to be recognized as a registrar under the project. So if I were to jump, let's see if I can do this reasonably quickly. If I were to jump to the sort of logical model of what we have, actually, no, I can go back in these slides. Let's go back a bit. It's a bit messy, this diagram, but just bear with me for a second. This area here, this sort of UN colored little circle, that's the idea of a repository, a directory of trusted registrars. So what we're considering in sort of 1 and 2, what are the eligibility requirements for a registrar to be recognized? You know, are you representative of a nation state? Do you have a legal framework for the registration process? Do you register things that are of interest to this particular scope, which is primarily supply chain related artifacts, and so on? So she's already written a draft, if you like, set of requirements for that, and then she's turned her attention through to the DIA itself. Does that make sense, Steve?
Yeah. And for Drummond, who you made a comment that sounds like a governance question. Yeah, I mean, half of this project is governance, I think, and that's one of the benefits of running this as a UN project, because there are already engagements with member states, and there's already mechanisms to ask member states for authoritative information about this or that. For example, logistics location codes. CEFACT's been running those. There's 100,000 of them now, contributed by member states. So I think half the value is exactly in this stuff, isn't it? The technical bit is, well, I won't call it trivial, but it's kind of the easy bit.
And it's going to evolve. I think the technical bit's going to evolve, isn't it? And what needs to sustain itself is that sort of governance and continued process. So I go back to this idea that the ICAO PKD is a bit of a template, simple thing. So that's the one that gives us the passports that we can travel with that do the electronic gate kind of stuff, where the public key is registered through ICAO's PKD system. That sort of is a rather simpler perhaps than we want to create with our directory, but it has some similar qualities. They self-maintain the data, they publish it through to ICAO PKD. They tell ICAO when there's a new public key, all this sort of stuff. The interesting thing about that, I've been looking at the MOU that substantiates that. So that's the governance framework for the PKD for ICAO. It's not that long. I think it's less than 20 pages. And I'd ask people to guess that. If you know the answer, then you go ahead. But what would you imagine the cost per year for a country to participate in the ICAO PKD? Any takers? Don't have to say.
We give us a little bit more definition there, John. When you say the cost per year.
So if you want to participate in the ICAO PKD, you need to meet certain requirements, a bit like the ones I've been describing. You need to be a nation state. You issue passports. Right. Now, if you want to, so it costs money to run the ICAO PKD. So there's a levy, a fee charged to the participants.
I see. So it's the fee that they charge to participate.
It's the fee that the ICAO, which is a UN entity, charges to the member state to use the register, to update and use the register of. Basically, it's a public key list.
Yeah.
I'll give away the answer. Right, it's $15,900 US. That's all for a country.
Okay.
I think it's remarkable. Excellent value. That's sort of, as a traveler with my passport, I think that's a pretty good deal. Anyway, that's a serious digression, but I was a bit surprised. So what the ICAO PKD MOU gives us is a template in some ways for how such a governance process might work, how it might be established, and so on. It's interesting. I'll go through this document a bit further because I also want to get onto Marcus's work. Marcus contributed some ideas on the original spec wording. So Alina's gone into a number of areas in this document, including consideration about what the content of the types might be. I think this is where, for example, I think the spec data structure that we were looking at a little earlier in the call with Steve sort of explaining how the vocabulary and so on works, that's likely to be the actual source of this, and we might reflect that in the clause or the requirement, but we won't work on it so much in this text, but we'll probably work on it in the actual sort of data definition spec. This is where we were entering into the discussions around you might want to include other identifiers, and we got into the reminder from Joe, I think, around the idea that there are levels of information that you issue, levels that you check, and levels that you haven't checked, and those are sort of important to differentiate. Semantic mapping and interoperability, that's obviously a core aim for the whole project, is to enable transparency at scale across all supply chains. As many of us know on this call, it's not easy to say, but it's even harder to do. And I think that's where a lot of the art and craft of recent work by a number of people on this call and others, things like overlay architectures, other things are potentially ways of helping solve that. Publishing the data schema, as Steve's provided earlier, is another mechanism that's necessary. So that's kind of a requirement that we'll have. And then we get into areas what you all see already. I'm on DIA number 29, a requirement number 29. There's a lot, and there are only 8 in the original document for all of the requirements for DIA. So there's a bit of an explosion here. So you'll see me kind of pulling a bit of a break on in the comment here, saying when we're looking at data protection and privacy, firstly, this is a global initiative, so it's not about just GDPR. It's not just Eurocentric. It's other parts of the world too. Secondly, this is a nation-state jurisdictional kind of lens. So they have whatever privacy laws and whatever things they have. If we were kind of above countries and just doing for the common good thing, we could make whatever statements we like. But really, here we probably have to say whatever your laws are your laws. I get kind of a little concerned when we start trying to elaborate more detail about privacy because it's both too long and too short, right? There's way more to say about it than this, and it could be said less. So basically,
yeah, I think you're right. It could collapse, didn't it? To data privacy should reflect your national laws. If you're GDPR.
So I kind of think we can compress some things. Bree.
Yeah. Wow. 29. That's a lot. I think
we haven't finished yet.
We haven't really bulked out the net new, which is the spec for the tech. So like when I think about this, you're very much so it's governance. And at the global scale, you're talking about nation states. But really you want a way to anchor in a decentralized fashion that somebody is who they are. And that's the net new. So like I'm just a little bit surprised that I'm also like still catching up a bit. But I have some questions. My first question is really geared towards my understanding of the spec as it was first developed, and that was, it's a trusted authority who's got some sort of regulation or teeth behind some governance already, that they are authorized to make a declaration about identity. And then on top of that, the net new being, we've engaged in a process that confirms control over that digital representation of ID. And we're attesting that these things come together, that the person and the digital piece are in fact the same. And this sort of builds trust. This is what builds trust. And there's different ways of doing this. And I'm curious to know what pieces of the spec so far are looking at those areas.
So great questions. So the spec, of course, that in a sense we're leaning on here, building on here, is the United Nations Transparency Protocol spec. And that's it's a supply chain focused specification. So it's about transparency at scale for trade. And therefore it's sort of, its units of currency, its thinking are to do with organizations and products and those conformity credentials as another artifact, sort of elements of trade transaction. We're less interested at the moment in the individual, the person, although at some point in time, evidently, officers of a company who's responsible for an organization, these things do come to bear, but we're not focusing on that level at the moment. We're focusing on organizational identity. The conundrum, I suppose, that we're trying to solve with this project is the idea that a participant in the supply chain makes a claim to be a certain company. Let's say, imagine I'm a Spanish company and I'm selling a product into Australia, and the potential consumer of this product, the company that's importing, say, of this product from Spain, wants to check that this company is actually that Spanish company. Now they can provide, they could mint their own verifiable credential. They could, sign it with their own keys, do some stuff, right, and make lay claims. But what you want to find out is the authority that they claim to have registered with actually the Spanish authority, or did they make that up as well? It's fairly easy in the world of deep fakes to sort of have levels of obscurity and fraud that are arbitrarily deep. So at some point, you need to sort of find an anchor, a point of trust that you can genuinely lean on. And that's sort of what this project is trying to establish, is how might we provide a trustworthy directory of all the registrars that register things that are useful for trade in the world, and therefore give confidence to participants that yes, that anchor was registered with the authority for Spain, and I can do the checks. And the way we want the technology to work is to allow those checks to be automatable, machine readable, verifiable, without having to sort of recourse to human intervention, which is the sort of next level. Go, Steve.
Yeah, I was going to say that the big difference between the DIA in UNTP and this project is probably not so much the DIA technical spec, it's the process by which the issuer gets registered on the UN Global Registry of Trusted Issuers.
Yes, that's the new
right. So that's the big difference, and maybe the requirements, or to separate the requirements for a DIA credential versus the requirements to get listed on the global register. I don't know.
I think they do. I think that's why when I did this diagram. So I've moved. So Steve did lots of the great work that I inherited for this project, but I'm kind of morphing a bit of the deliverables that the project sort of established at the beginning into these 5 that you see on the screen in front of you. So yes, the DIA. What we want to say about the digital identity anchor is a build on the UNTP, but arguably it's not the new thing. It's if we can find something of value to add to the spec, we do. But things like eligibility requirements to be met by registries, that's a new thing. What would the directory include? What's useful to include in such a directory? That's a new thing. And obviously the governance is a very new thing. How would such a thing be governed? And that's where we want to lean on existing things like KOPKD, low code, and other established systems. And on the side, of course, we're going to do some implementation pilots as well, all before by the end of the year, by the way, for anybody on the call. Yeah, in your spare time. Okay, so we're getting sort of got 10 minutes. I like to finish these at about 10 minutes to the top of the hour so that you've got time to get to your next meeting or do whatever you need to do, because they tend to start at the top of an hour, in my experience, for most people. So I'll go through this and not do the service to Alina she deserves. But there are 43 in total, Brie, already. And I think that number is both scary and probably too many, right? So it's sort of, I think this is a body of work I certainly don't want to lose any value of, but I kind of feel it's a way, maybe there's a sort of summary of it, or there's a condensation of it or something. It doesn't need to be so detailed prescriptive. It's sort of illustrative in some respects. So we'll work out how to handle it. It probably won't look as complicated as this when we get to it. And then we have some sort of non-normative explanatory text. So the first chunk of this document is to do with the sort of requirements as such, and then the next chunk is the sort of non-normative. Now, these documents are all available to all of you. We've given them a kind of globally accessible link quality so that anybody can comment on them and view them. There are only a few editors. So if I go now back to the meeting sort of structure, I will do one thing before I get there. Sorry, I'm going to break and go back a bit. I want to talk a little bit about what Marcos did. So Marcos is based usually, I think, in Panama, or certainly South America. And he's got a lot of experience in building systems for the South American countries to do with trade. And what he did was he went through this spec as it stood. He pulled it down from the markdown into a document, and then went through and made some comments. So what I need to do is to work through with Marcos his comments to sort of see. Some of them are just ideas about simplifying wording or other comments from a reader's point of view, which is always welcome. I know that certainly from my work, I value it when people read it. I go, oh, yes, you're right. It would be better if I wrote it that way. Obviously, when we get to things like requirements, we're going to merge the work somehow of what we're seeing already from Alina, what I described earlier from the requirements for registrars, eligibility requirements, and so on. We need to sort of make those fit together in a way. And he's gone through this sort of document in some detail. So where I got to yesterday were these questions for decisions. So I'm keen to bring all this work back into sort of one place, or into the places it belongs, and not have them scattered around. I had sort of 3 options, where C was one I couldn't think of at the time, but I could work and resolve the comments in Alina and Marcos's documents sort of separately, and then try and combine the results, or I could combine them now and then sort of work forward. My preference, and this is what Sankashan, who was on the call yesterday and is on the call again today, which is a Herculean effort since he's based in India, is willing to help me on. So I'll repeat that offer, Sankashan. So yes, then Drummond said yes to let's combine them first with the comments in them, and then do the resolution. So readers can then see a kind of a better map, I suppose, better completeness of the documents when they're considering them. So that's kind of where we got to yesterday. Sankashan's willing to help, which is fabulous. We can do this asynchronously, and anybody else in this call is very welcome to help too. Steve.
I'm just going to point out there's probably a point somewhere after you've combined and done where it's not final, but it's good enough to publish to the GitLab website that you're going to create, and from then on, you're kind of, managing change in a history of well-documented issues and things like this, right? Which really helps to give trust to the change management process.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. All of these documents at the moment are kind of Google Doc things in a Google document space, which makes them kind of very fluid and easy and quick to edit and change with, much like it's a word processor. But that's not quite the same as having good control and so on of documents. So yes, you're right, Steve. We'll move these when they're mature enough. We need to move them into the GitLab environment. And I think I had that up and running at one point. Yeah, well, this is the GitLab environment. So if I go into CEFACT, the sort of more, there are 4 projects already under this UNICC environment, and the spec GTR is this particular project. The space at the moment, it's basically just got a simple README, Markdown README, and I haven't done anything to this actually. And then we'll fill this out with the content that we're generating from here. Bear in mind, though, some of the content Steve's agreed earlier, will move back into the UNTP spec if as appropriate. So if it's a sort of specification, particularly about the digital identity anchor, it will probably be better and easier to understand if it's in the UNTP spec again. Drummond, you have your hand up.
I was only going to second Steve's response to this sort of classic trajectory we've seen to trust over IP is you work the Google Doc, the fluid one, until you have something that's basically consolidated, even if it's got a lot of issues, and then it's a good time to go over and start the PR process, because it's PR process too heavyweight for that early stuff, but then it's really needed once you get to the. So anyway, I was just going to reinforce that. I think that works well. That's all.
Thank you. Anne.
Yes, just a quick question. Your slide, I presume that you share with us. May I ask where they would be?
They're always shared, Anne. I share everything. They're on the project site at the moment, but they're on the project sort of web pages. Joe, it looks like he's busy pasting a URL into the chat as we speak. So this deck, what I've been doing for each of these presentations is effectively, if I break out of the slideshow view, you'll see that there are. So to Bree's question earlier, there are in this deck, the same one I'm using, as pretty well all the content we've so far discussed in the, 6, 8 meetings we've had on the project so far, including a walkthrough of how the digital identity anchor sort of concept works, and a whole bunch of other things. So I've been kind of adding to this deck and just showing a few slides from it, rather than showing them all, because there's no way I'm going to go through 67 slides in less than an hour, even though I speak too quickly. So that's there, and you've got full access to it. And each of the meetings, I've sort of split off a deck for each meeting so that the record of the meeting can point to the deck that was used for that meeting. And that's sort of what each of these has. So there's a number of very similar looking decks, each one getting slightly larger, and that's the process.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome. And also the recordings minutes of each meeting is available as well. So it's a quick way to get to meetings. There's a meetings folder I've shared on groups.io and on the Slack channels that you can see all of the recordings for previous meetings and the minutes of as well.
Great. Thanks.
Okay. So that's cool. Thank you for the offer reviews and stuff, Drummond. I did see that float by, so that's great. Anything you can do is always gratefully received. So we'll over the next couple of weeks work on this sort of consolidation of the work that was done past 2 weeks, and hopefully come up with a kind of clean copy for review. Maybe even moving into the GitLab space, maybe in 2 weeks' time. Bree.
Okay, so you're saying by the end of this year, you want to
Yes.
a pilot. Okay, so this is good news.
Yeah, isn't it?
Well, it is great news. So we've been having some discussion, BC Gov, with federal agencies around digital trust and looking to pilot something kind of quick and easy, low-hanging fruit. And to me, this is the most obvious fit that
Excellent.
And so how are you going to run pilots for this?
So So firstly, thank you very much, and yes, please. I'm looking for. I'm scrolling around, looking for the schedule that I normally have in this deck somewhere towards the end, and I can't see it at the moment. But anyway, we're just about at the time where we should start working on the pilots according to the schedule that we have, that we've sort of tried to maintain. We hope for 2 pilots. The process is, in a sense, for each pilot, we're going to obviously describe what the pilot's objectives are. What do we want to prove or test or make, sort of see if it does actually work the way we hope it to work. So there will be a bit of discussion with the sort of pilot promoters about what works for them. Your contribution would be fabulous. The other that's obviously likely also is the Registradores of Spain. Because they're with Alina as a co-lead, they're very actively involved in this project, so they're very likely to be one of the other pilots. They have one of the things they clearly are interested in, because it's part of what they're doing right now, is the interaction between themselves and Glyph. That's been a frequent topic of conversation with the Spanish Registradores, so that might be one of the angles that they pursue.
But one of the, before I was asking a bit about the transparency register and beneficial ownership, because there's some interplay on most of the provincial jurisdictions with the feds around the interplay between a registered business in the province and a federal registration. And I just want to understand how then the registry is, like, how that would then fit with the federal transparency register signing up with the global registry. Is that kind of the idea?
So one of the truisms for this project is that registries around the world have different levels of development and maturity, and they do different things. And we can't sort of run a rule across all of them. Well, you can say there's a sort of minimum floor that you need to do to get in, if you like, because otherwise you're not really a registry and you don't have a legal basis and so on. So there's minimum requirements, which we referred to earlier. But where it gets to details like, do you do a substantive check of beneficiary ownership as part of your registration process? That's going to vary significantly between countries. And why I pull this slide up again for is that that's actually work that Glyph already does, because they had to, under the sort of Financial Stability Board's requirements, they had to start looking into what they call level 2 data for organizations. So what you might choose to do as a registrar is, well, we might, for legal reasons, for our own determination, for our own nation state, want to do that because we want to do what we want to do the best we can for British Columbia or Canadians or whatever. Or they might say, we recognize that Glyph is already doing this, at least from a financial perspective, and we'll actually recognize that and lean on it or make use of it. For me, this is a kind of practical but political decision to make for each country.
It'd be quite good to have Canada in a pilot as well, right? Because the other 2 candidates are both very centralized governments, right? Spain and India, if they participate. Sankarshan, are you from the Indian government or just happen to have an Indian sounding name? Sorry to ask.
I am not from the Indian government.
All right. Because we do have some interest from them, right? And they obviously run one of the world's largest identity registers.
Yes.
But if we had just India and Spain, that's already huge. But what we wouldn't have there is a federal system like Canada's.
Well,
right? Even Australia, it's a federal government system, but actually the business register is federal only. So Canada's actually a better use case for it would be like the US, right?
And I've just seen that Anthony had to dive off for another meeting, but Anthony D'Souza was on the call earlier, Steve, from Austrade. So sort of quietly but constructively lurking. Yes, you're right. Even if we do bring ASIC in or Austrade in, you're right. It's a centralized system, despite having a federated government
system of government. Yes.
And there was some talk with the FIDE's architecture. They were quite interested in the UNTP DIA. That's FIDE's. Who is that? Is that Austrian? No.
FIDE is. That's a it's a kind of a community group of tech projects in Europe.
Yeah, they were quite interested in the DIA?
So-
We're likely, I hope, I know we are going to attract the interest of a number of organizations that are setting up a either commercial or not-for-profit structure for trust registries of different types. And their participation, I guess, is welcome, but it's not quite the same as a nation state's participation as an authoritative registrar. There's an organization that's sort of spin-off of some of the founders of Glyph that's called Verifiable Trade, for example, verifiable.trade. And you know, that they will want to provide some value and do some stuff, and they may want to sort of participate. But in a sense, our primary focus is on United Nations nation members, authoritative registrars. So
I think that's quite good, right? It puts us in the right box, because we don't want to be doing what Drummond's already doing with ARA, or what Glyph is doing with Glyph. This is really, in a way, it's empowering both of them, right? Because Glyph already has to figure out how to do their local verification, and what better way than to present a DIA?
So absolutely right. Now I'm going to get to Paul in a second, but you've excited me, Steve. So this little thing I'm hovering over right now, what Glyph maintain already is a thing that they call the registration authorities list. It's a side effect of the registration of companies through LOUs, that they recognize where did that company get registered. So they keep a list of those they've seen that come through them in a sort of side effect of the registration process for LEIs. What we would be able to provide them is a sort of authoritative list to wash against their data. You know, is anything coming through that sort of doesn't match? They've got a registrar that doesn't exist as far as we're concerned. Thanks, Drummond. So yeah, it is, I think, a value add for both. Paul.
Thanks, John. In terms of has a perspective from the Australian government perspective, Anthony would probably attest to this, when this is discussed at a federal level, it's in the forum where you've got trade is only one stakeholder, and most of the discussion is around digital identity, rather than trade verifiable credentials, if that makes sense. And I think, you know, but they're still, and the same goes for some of the other discussions such as OpenID Foundation as well. Everybody's still trying to work out, how do I create trust?
So you're right, very right, Paul. So in Australia, OpenID is a bank system for identity amongst the big four banks, and others are welcome to join too. And the most of the focus, for the political focus in Australia, has been on digital ID acts and so on. These are about personal identity systems, much like Europe has the IDAS and other such structures. So, and UK has DIAT and so on. But you're right, this is not looking at identity of people to start with. And yet, I think the time for most countries now is actually, this should attract a lot of attention, because almost every country in the world is looking at productivity. So there is an argument to be made that digital identity for people will eventually support productivity growth and so on, and reduce risks and harms. But there's a very easier to do maths around trade and around trustworthy trade and transparency. And the numbers are sort of chunkier. They're bigger and there's fewer numbers to play with, but they're bigger numbers about trade and what this. So I think you can attract the attention of government at a federal level and state level, because this does offer an opportunity to improve business efficiency and net gains in productivity.
I suppose all I'm trying to point out, though, if you look at the EU large-scale pilots, for example, around digital identity, one of the use cases was organisation identity. There is discussions at a Australian federal government level around the same thing. So it's not just personal identity, but it is looking at organisational identity.
That's absolutely true.
And then in a banking context, it's also, you've got KYC from a business perspective as well. So I suppose all I'm trying to just reflect on is that whilst this is purely around supply chain, purely around trade, there are some components of this, or parts of this, that other things like open banking.
Yeah, look, Paul,
are trying
I
to
would have
solve.
said, yes, its origin is in trade, but one of the reasons to spin this off as a separate project is to decouple it somewhat from the pure use case of how can I be confident who signed that invoice in a cross-border trade sense, to how can I be confident who issued any self-issued document, right? Digital product passport, whatever it is. And actually, whether it's cross-border or domestic, it's much the same question, right? In Australia, there's this e-invoicing framework, which depends on this sort of network of hub operators. And if you think about how the trust works there, it's basically to do with how each hub registers their party. And a much better trust architecture would be to attach even domestic transactions to an authoritative business ID, and not depend on this or that platform that you've got to route your messages through being the identity. You know, Australia's like PEPOL in Europe too has conflated, I think, technical routing architecture with identity authority architecture, and it's a big mistake, I think. You know, so we hope this is more generally useful, but at the same time, we're going to encounter, exactly as you said, similar initiatives that might come from a different background.
Yeah.
And then the question is, well, how do you align, and how do you not duplicate, and how do you do something that meets our needs, but also doesn't conflate or confuse these other initiatives? And you know, that's maybe why we're lucky to have people like yourself on the call, right? That can point out these opportunities for alignment.
Yeah, I mean, I just think we specifically were talking at the Australian government level about, well, if you take it back to a pure technical level, for example, you've got a company may have a DID, right? But do they get a DID? How do you verify that that DID is actually attached to that company?
So that's the essence of what we're talking about.
That is what this does.
Correct. But the point being is, from and sorry, I'll talk Australian government perspective. You know, if ASIC, you know, issues a certificate of incorporation, there's not a specific. Ideally, they should just be issued one certificate of incorporation as a verified credential, as an example, not multiple, if that makes sense.
Well,
Yeah.
I think there's a separate. We should separate, and what you're hinting at is there are changes here for the way National Register behaves, right? So you register a company and you issue an identifier like an ACN or an ABN once, right? And then you manage it through its life cycle. What we're saying is, as trade goes on, a particular company might, for whatever reason, have 20 different DIDs, perhaps because they cycle over time, perhaps because they use one for trading with this country and one for international, one for whatever. And the challenge is, how can I prove that DID is also linked to my ABN? The consequence means that the ATO or ASIC would be issuing DIAs, multiple DIAs, or updating a single DIA with a list of DIDs, right? So I prove I control this DID. I get a DIA and it says ABN XYZ DID 123. Then I come back 4 weeks later and say, hey, I control another DID. This is part of the process, right? Now, do I get a second DIA, or do I get do I obsolete the old one, issue a new one with two DIDs in the list? And then when I want to cancel a DID because I don't control it anymore, or I lost the private key or something, you know, these are the processes that we've got to talk about. But I think it would be a mistake to sort of lock it in to say one DID, one ABN for all time. That's what we explicitly do not want to do, I think, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think so I go back to this sort of the model I showed. You're exactly right, Paul, and of course Steve. But the issuance process around, I have proved myself to be who I say I am. I've got my ABN or ACN number in Australia, and now I'm going to give you some DIDs I'd like you to recognize as owned or controlled by me. You should do some tests to see if I do control these, and then you mint a DIA. But as Steve's just articulating, and you've also been articulating, Paul, there's a life cycle stuff to think about here. It means for people like ASIC in Australia, potentially new revenue models, new services, new things you can do, new values you can provide the socio-economic community of Australia. So it's not necessarily just an extra cost or burden. It could be other things. So
I think even within a national economy, it would be interesting to do a business benefit analysis of this at some point, because the cost of and risk associated with identity in business-to-business transactions, something the government often doesn't see, is huge. Right?
Yeah.
Some large corporates have literally a room full of people proving who you are and calling you up, and is that really your ABN, or did you steal it from the ABR and just pretend to be Rio Tinto? And it's just an ongoing burden on an economy, right?
I do want to draw to a close, not because I want the conversation to stop, mindful of people's time, but I'll selfishly finish with one thing that you've reminded me of, Steve. A few years ago, RMIT, who have an economics wing that looks at new technologies, it's primarily and rather blindly focused on blockchain, but it's got some interesting people writing very interesting economics papers. Did an assessment of the cost of verification and trust in the US economy. And what they did, exactly right, Bree. What they did was they said, well, how many people in any given organization are employed to check stuff, to see if something's right, to sort of follow up and do what Steve just described about, are you actually that company? Are you? And they figured it's about a third. So they came up with this. I'll share the link to the paper afterwards. But
sounds a bit much, but yeah.
Of course, it is. It's colorful. It's Professor Ian Potts, so it's always going to be colorful. But it's a fascinating way of thinking about the problem, right? And of course, you might also then move to thinking, well, what will those third of the people do if we take that role away from them? It's another question it's a social economic question, but it came up with a very large number as to that's what it costs us to check stuff. And I think that was it was a deliberately provocative economics paper, but I'll share a link for those of you who haven't seen it. It is quite an interesting angle.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, I do need to give you the freedom to go back to your the rest of your days and evenings. Thank you very, very much, all of you. Minutes, transcripts, chats will be available, and I hope to see you next time.
Thanks. So good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great job.
Cheers.
Hello, guys.
Thanks, guys. Bye.